I found a mentor who he was highly critical, very intimidating, but he managed to, through redlining many of my attempts and really showing me exactly what was going wrong, how my writing was impacting the reviewer in ways that I didn't understand, I hadn't ever considered. Ultimately, that settled in and turned everything around for me. The only problem was it became intuitive. It was more of an intuitive thing than a systematic thing. So I've spent years trying to develop and figure out how can I express that in a systematic way for other people. And I'm going to share a little bit of that with you in just a second. Stress, fear, and worry about your grants. It's something I can definitely relate to. This idea that when you're sitting down to write, to try to get funding for your research, it's intense. It's always been intense, but I think especially now, even though I'm no longer writing grants, I observe for others who are still doing that, if you're still doing that it's intense. So that's what I want to talk about, is how you can address some of that stress, that fear, that worry, before I get into the concrete. And I've got something really good for you here that I wish I had known. And so I first want to introduce myself in case we haven't met. I'm Dr. Morgan Giddings. I was a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. I ultimately was tenured, got tenure, and then later on chose to leave the faculty there. But early in my faculty career, I really struggled with grants. And I had a lot of rejections. I was in a medical school, and I was told, as part of medical school, I had to bring in money or I wouldn't be staying there long term. That's just the way it was. So it was a huge pressure for me. And the first 3 or so years that I was there, really I had a lot of failure, a lot of rejection, and a ton of anxiety, just like this black cloud hovering over my head. And it got worse because when I first started, I was pretty enthusiastic. There was some anxiety because I was like, I knew this was important, and I knew that I had to really impress the reviewer. I knew I had to somehow connect with something. I didn't know exactly what I was supposed to be doing. I sort of thought of it as like a book report in a way that I'd written in college. And I was pretty good. I got pretty good in college and graduate school at writing my reports sort of last minute, throwing them together, making them work, and as time went on, getting pretty good grades at that. And so I think that's how I saw this whole thing when I started out in my faculty job, that really it's like, okay, I can kind of do this semi-last minute. I mean, I knew I couldn't do it at just start the day before or something. I wasn't that naive. But maybe 3 weeks before that I could really put together something that sounds pretty good. And again, there was anxiety, but it wasn't like this crushing anxiety at the time. There was a lot of enthusiasm, so I did it. And then I got rejected, and I did that again, and I got rejected, and I did that again, and I got rejected. And then the real doubt and the real anxiety started to set in for me. And it was a couple years of just one after another rejection and losing confidence and feeling like, what is wrong with me? Either the system is broken or I'm broken, one of those two things. And either one is not a good, if the system's broken, then what's the point? And I'm not saying the system's not broken, but what I discovered later is that the system is pretty messed up, and it's gotten even more messed up than since when I started, which was a little over 20 years ago, when I started in the system. And I'm no longer in the system. I just do training and consulting for people, many of whom are still researchers who are in science. And so the system is messed up, but what I learned is that also how I was approaching it was not so effective. And the way I was approaching it created a lot of anxiety. And I want to focus in on one particular aspect of that anxiety that I had, and that I think clients that I work with have had. I became aware of this when a client recently shared with my team when we take people through our process. It's called Grant Foundry Accelerator, and there are 4 different phases we go through to really prepare and create a great grant proposal. And in the 3rd phase, which we call the planning phase of this process, what we do is we take the scientific idea from the previous phase that we develop, and we try to make the outline or the sketch of a story that is going to connect between the reviewer's point of view and what we're trying to promote, and our science that we're trying to put forth is what I'm trying to say here. So in that process of this planning phase, planning this story, we have to understand, really think about where the reviewer is coming from. And what are their current thoughts? What are their current frames, perspectives, you could call that, on the field, on what's good, what's not so good? What are they likely to get excited about? And what are they likely to get frustrated by? So this client that I'm talking about, he, after going through that process of really researching that, because that's the first part we do in that planning phase, is researching that. And by the way, AI is great for assisting with this. And I think it's one of the better uses of AI in grant writing. I think there are some very poor uses in grant writing. But this one, I wish I had this tool when I was facing so much of that frustration, because we can dive in and really learn about what do typical people in this field think, and what are the nuanced facets, different facets of this field, like this sort of sub-niches in the field that might be our reviewers, and what are their perspectives, both the things that they're excited about, but the things that will really just make them say no, like raise their defenses, raise their hackles. And this is one of the things that really is such a cause of anxiety if you're a grant writer, if you're trying to get funding for your lab, is not knowing when you're going to trip over one of those things, one of those landmines of just, it's like shooting in the dark. It's like there's this boogeyman out there, this negative reviewer response that when you submit this, that it might provoke. And again, especially if you're like me and you got rejected, maybe you started enthusiastic, but then you got rejected a bunch of times. And then you're like, I don't know what the problem is. I don't know why I keep triggering this rejection. What's going on with this? And it becomes like a guessing game. I found some research recently about anxiety and the unknown. It was from 2018, and it found a strong link between many anxiety disorders and fear of the unknown. And that's exactly what I think as grant writers, grant applicants, we are facing. We are putting our heart and soul, whether it's last minute or we spend months on it, it's still putting all of our energy into this thing to try to get a good result, to try to get the funding that we need. And we pour all of ourselves into it, and then we submit it. And then the typical result, because only 1 in 10 or so are funded right now, the typical result is to get back a rejection, a critique that says, no, this wasn't good enough. Sorry. Maybe try again, if it was at least good enough that they were semi-enthusiastic. And then there are usually some critiques, but the critiques are often about our techniques or methods. And it's hard to know, especially if you've been doing this for a few times, it's hard to know if those critiques are actually the real problem, because I've tried, and many of my clients have had the same experience, where you take those critiques, you revise your proposal, you think you're addressing the critique, you submit it again, and it comes back and it's not better. It's not a better result. Sometimes they critique totally different things, or sometimes it's the same things, or it just seems like they're never satisfied. And it's like, why aren't these people, these reviewers, ever satisfied? And it's so frustrating. I'm kind of like going back in memory to the nightmare that was. It's so frustrating. And I think it's frustrating because it is really unclear. It's unknown. And that anxiety about the unknown is actually what I think makes us even worse grant writers. It makes it, not only is it unpleasant to be in that mode of anxiety constantly when we're thinking about trying to get funding, and for many people that's like a constant worry, so it's a constant anxiety, right? Not a good thing. But it also affects our actual writing of the proposals. And that certainly happened to me, because my results when I started my first rejection, it was a rejection, but a couple of the reviewers liked it. It was actually an NSF proposal, was my very first attempt, National Science Foundation here in the United States. That was my very first attempt. And there were a couple of the reviewers that one gave it an excellent, I don't know if I got any outstandings. I might have gotten one outstanding. There were like 5 reviewers. So it went from there down to fair. There wasn't any poor rating. So it was like a reasonable distribution. At least some people liked it. But then I revised it and it actually got worse. And then I started doing NIH proposals and started getting poor scores. And that actually got worse to the point that I was triaged. So why did it get worse? And why does that happen? I've seen this also with so many applicants where they start a faculty job and sometimes they have that so-called, quote, beginner's luck. I don't think it's beginner's luck. I don't think it's purely luck. I think there's an element of this anxiety factor to it, that when you're young and new and enthusiastic, you don't hold back. You're not fearful and overly conservative or cautious or defensive in your writing. And I'll talk about what those modes of anxiety, what it causes in your writing. So you're not doing those. I think many people, when they start, are less likely to do those. I mean, there can be still performance anxiety for some people, but certainly early on, I had less of that than after I had had like 4, 5, 6 rejections. Then I was in full-on anxiety panic mode. And what that anxiety caused for me, and I've seen cause for other people, is often overloading my grant text with so much detail, unnecessary detail, to prove myself to this reviewer that I know what I'm doing. One of the things that happened to me with some of my NIH attempts was that I'd had enough rejections where I had put in a lot of data and a lot of information on my first page, my specific aims page, or for NSF, my project summary page, where I'd really packed it pretty densely. And I'd had a lot of rejections. So I'm like, okay, well, I guess that didn't work. So I guess I've got to do something that doesn't have nearly as much information or different kinds of information. So I tried a completely different approach. I got like a 52 percentile score. My point to you is that we get into this mode of anxiety, of just fear and worry. And the more rejections accumulate, sometimes we start that way, but it can get worse and worse and snowball. And then it makes us actually worse writers because we're not worrying about the reviewer and we're not sharing an awesome idea that we're enthusiastic about. We're instead worried about their responses, worried about guessing at their responses, and often guessing poorly or guessing subconsciously. We may hear some kind of myths or rumors that certain things, like a common one is that you have to have 3 aims. Unless you're in certain places, then they tell you, I know of one person who's in a department where everybody in that department says you've got to have 2 aims and only 2 aims for your RO1 proposal. Okay, what about all those departments where they say it's 3 aims that you have to have for your proposal? That's an example of like anxious guessing, of just like not really understanding what is really triggering the reviewer, but instead just having this anxious guesswork for what is going on. And that's exactly what was happening for me until I worked with my mentor. I found a mentor who he was highly critical, very intimidating, but he managed to, through redlining many of my attempts and really showing me exactly what was going wrong, how my writing was impacting the reviewer in ways that I didn't understand, I hadn't ever considered. Ultimately, that settled in and turned everything around for me. The only problem was it became intuitive. It was more of an intuitive thing than a systematic thing. So I've spent years trying to develop and figure out how can I express that in a systematic way for other people. And I'm going to share a little bit of that with you in just a second. But first, I want to see if I can edit in a little clip here of just showing the result of revising that proposal, revising that specific aims page after that intervention from that mentor. So hopefully that illustrates for you how that really changed by starting to pay attention to what the reviewer is really thinking about, what they are concerned with, what they're excited by, what they're interested in, what they're intrigued by. All of those things, by taking those into account, it makes your proposal something that they can relate to and be excited by and not trip over those landmines. I call that process, I came up with a name for it because I hadn't heard anybody else talk about it. I call it frame meshing. When you bring, your reviewer starts out with a frame, you start out with a frame. Your frame might be one of, I need funding. And usually, hopefully it's not just I need funding, but here's this exciting project, here's this interesting idea or technique or method or thing that I want to do. That's your frame as the writer. Your reviewer's frame is, I've been charged with this not very fun task of reviewing proposals, and it's kind of my duty and responsibility to do a good job. So I'm going to try to do a good job of really deciding what is worthwhile and what's not. So I've got to be really critical about the science and about what's important here and make some hard decisions. And so that's their frame, right? And when you think about those two very different frames, in most cases they clash. It's like they run into each other, and whenever there's a frame clash, you, as the grant applicant, you lose. That's what was happening to me. Rejection, rejection, rejection. That is frame clash. That is losing that conflict. So my term for what we want to do instead is frame meshing, where instead of boom, crash, it's more of it's bringing them together. It's saying, hey, dear reviewer, I'm joining you with where you're at over here, with what you're concerned about in the field and what you think is worthwhile and what you think is not worthwhile, and taking you on a journey that shows you step by step, leads you down a path step by step to see why this thing that I'm proposing over here, my frame, actually fits with your frame. That's what I mean by frame meshing. We're not trying to contradict them. We're not trying to fight them, because when you try to fight your reviewer, you lose. Ask me how I know that thing. I lost many times. Lots of anxiety, lots of pain. We don't want to do that. We don't want to fight our reviewer. We want to frame mesh with them. We want to take them on a journey so that they understand, so that they can connect with what they want out of this reviewing experience and what they need and what they perceive as the right thing, that we're connecting with them on that journey and taking them on that journey. And I can't guarantee that will instantly get you funding. There are no guarantees, especially in the current environment. There are no guarantees, but I can certainly say that it will go better for your reviewer, and as a result, likely better for you. What's really important about this is that for your own anxiety, for your own writing process, when you start to see the exact things that trigger a reviewer, and you understand those things and why those are triggering your reviewer, why they're creating more of a frame clash, when you start really enumerating those, rather than that being guesswork or just your subconscious habits or whatever a colleague randomly told you is true or not true, but you're specifically understanding for this reviewer audience, what are the things that they're going to be triggered by. I call those defensive frames, the things that raise their defenses, defensive frames. When you start enumerating those defensive frames that are specific to that reviewer audience, it's illuminating. It's, oh, wow, okay, I can see why they reacted to that thing. I can see what I have to do to avoid tripping over this concern or this defense. You have a list. You can work off the list. So we literally, when we're doing this work with clients, we make a list of the defensive frames that we're likely to encounter. And then we make another list, which is the offensive frames, which is the opposite side. It's like the frames that we know are likely to get this audience excited. Now, I want to be careful here before I go any further and just say this is not about trying to manipulate or lie to people about doing something that you're not doing. You still have to have, the assumption I'm making here is you have to have really good science. You have to have what we call a big idea, which we develop in a whole other phase of our process. You have to have a big idea that has really compelling science that your reviewers are likely to be interested in. And if you don't have that, then everything that I'm telling you about offensive and defensive frames, it's not going to solve your problems, except maybe your own anxiety. It will solve some of the anxiety problem, regardless of results. But if you really care about the results of this process, this is something that's important to do, to recognize these offensive and defensive frames. And if you don't have that great science, that great big idea at the core of your proposal, this is necessary but not sufficient, what I'm talking about with these frames. So to continue, it's you research these offensive frames and defensive frames, and we get into some other details that I just won't go into here because this will get too long. And then we make lists of them. And then as we plan our story out for the reader, before we really start writing it and putting it into prose, we actually make an outline structure based upon these offensive and defensive frames, based upon addressing them and taking them, the reviewer, on a journey where they're not falling into these potholes, these defensive frames, and then it's game over for us when that happens. And where they're continuing to be interested and excited and see the relevance of this. So rather than going on here a lot longer, what I want to do is invite you to a webinar that I'm doing, actually a meeting, a Zoom meeting that I'm having about this, where I'm going to go into more detail than I have time for here in this video, and I can actually show you some slides. I'm not going to overload it, but show you some slides about how we actually decompose those offensive frames, those defensive frames, and how we start weaving them together into a story. So I'm doing that on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday. It is 11 a.m. Mountain Time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and I'll be going over all of this, spending an hour with you and taking the time to answer some questions and also giving you a few minutes to actually do a little bit of this research yourself. And if you are somebody who uses AI, who embraces that, you can do your homework with that. If you're not, that's okay, because you can still do this on your own It's just a little bit slower, honestly, but it's perfectly fine to do this without AI as well. And I think it's really going to be illuminating this process of doing this. And whether you can join us or not, I really encourage you to think about this the next time you're preparing for a grant proposal, because coming back to that client story that I started with and I never closed the loop on, so now I'm going to finally close the loop. That client was saying, one of the most important things that I got from working with the team here was this clarity and a reduction, a substantial reduction in the anxiety, because now this stuff that had just been subconscious or not obvious was suddenly clear and obvious. Oh, I see why this thing triggers the reviewers in this way, and this thing triggers them in that way, and how this thing is going to get them excited, but this thing certainly is not. And really making that very clear before the writing begins in earnest. So powerful. And again, that anxiety reduction makes you more capable as a writer, I shouldn't say it does make you more capable, but it makes you less likely to exhibit the negative traits of anxiety-prone writing, such as fact or data overload, or making it too minimalistic, or many of the other things that occur when you're writing from this standpoint of being anxious. Now you have a list. You have a list. And you know exactly what you're dealing with. And that's always better than trying to deal with the unknown and the anxiety that produces. So that's my message for today. And before I go, I'd love your support in terms of a like, a subscribe, sharing it with a colleague if you think this is helpful. And if you choose to join us on Tuesday, 11 a.m. Mountain Time for the Zoom meeting, I'll make sure that the link goes up on the video and it goes into the text for the video, the description, video description. The link will be right there for you, and I hope to see you there. This is Dr. Morgan Giddings. I'm rooting for you.